Thank you for having me. Geolibertarianism is the fusion of libertarian philosophy with the economic ideas of 19th century American social reformer Henry George. The term geolibertarianism was coined by economist and California professor Fred E. Foldbury. What both the libertarian and the Georgist schools of thought have in common is that they both support decentralization, voluntary and simpler taxation, and refraining from taxing ordinary personal income. Before explaining geolibertarianism in depth, I'd like to provide some historical and economic context for this idea, and talk about some important questions we should be asking ourselves about tax policy, especially considering the state's mounting budget problems and that the Lake County and Illinois property tax rates are among the highest in the nation. Namely, we should ask ourselves, what would you do if increasing your property value did not always result in higher property taxes? What would you do on your property if you could increase the value of your home as much as you wish but never see a tax increase? What improvements would you make to your home if you never had to pay taxes on the value of your home and you never had to pay for permits and variances to improve your own property? Why should we be paying taxes on our own property in the first place? If our homes and any economic activities that go on inside of them were untaxed, then we could fully own our homes and keep everything we produce inside of them without surrendering any of the fruits of our labor to the government. Maybe we could even become independent enough to sustain ourselves without needing taxation or government programs in the first place. What is the property tax anyway? Is it an unfair compulsory tax which is based on the use of land, or is it a rent which is voluntarily paid to the community for the privilege of occupying land? Whether property taxes are taxes or rents, why do I have to pay for something that I own? Also, we know that when taxes are too high, the incentive to earn money is effectively removed through confiscation by the government. Earning income through labor, through selling goods and services, and through using land is all productive, victimless behavior. To tax income, sales, and land use more would only cause people to work less and earn less in order to avoid the increased taxes associated with more income and higher productivity. This concept was articulated by Art Laffer and is what has come to be known as the Laffer curve. Laffer, an economic advisor to Presidents Ford and Reagan, theorized that some rate of taxation may exist whereby raising or lowering that tax rate would result in lower revenues. If most people feel comfortable paying 50% of their income towards taxes, then we might say the Laffer curve peaks at 50. But if it can be shown that even the slightest amount of taxation serves to discourage the earning of additional income, then the Laffer curve peaks at 0%. What do you think would happen if we stopped levying taxes that we now know only serve to discourage and deter the activities being taxed, usually harmless, productive activities? What if instead of accidentally discouraging helpful activities with our tax code, we use taxation as a tool to intentionally punish activities that we all agree are harmful and aggressive, such as waste and destruction? Simply put, why are we taxing production instead of destruction? While some believe that there's not enough evidence to support the Laffer curve's apparent implication that lower taxes could even lead to higher revenues, everything that the economic refugees fleeing Illinois are telling us seem to indicate that higher property taxes and high income taxes are among the most direct and important causes of migration out of the state. Although taxing income does yield high revenues and ensure that the costs of government are distributed somewhat evenly among those capable of doing productive work, there's no practical economic reason to tax income. As I stated earlier, income shouldn't be taxed because it's our property, which we earn through productive, harmless activities. To tax the earning of income is to discourage the earning of income, is to incentivize dependence upon others. Furthermore, federal income taxes and capital gains tax placed on top of state income taxes mean double taxation and even multiple taxation for Illinoisans. Additionally, with a brief exception during the Civil War, the federal government went the first 120 years of its history without taxing the personal income of its citizens. Income taxes pay for only one half of the current federal budget. We did without the federal income tax before, and we can do it again. 13th Amendment to the Constitution acknowledges we have the right to be free from involuntarily serving others, except for punishment as a punishment for a crime. What crime are we committing by earning money and by buying, selling, trading, and investing? Ask a libertarian if we must have taxes, then what kind of taxes would be best? And you might get an answer something like taxes that are paid voluntarily. So this line of reasoning goes, if you can be convinced that a tax is in your best interest, or if you would continue paying service or use fees, even if you were no longer required to pay the tax, then the tax is voluntary, or it would be, or it could be. I'm not going to try to claim that the income tax is strictly voluntary, but another line of reasoning about voluntary taxes go like this. If you agree to engage in the activity which is being taxed, then you agree to the tax. If you want to avoid the tax, then don't engage in the activity being taxed. We could argue about whether that's fair or not, but I digress. If we apply this idea to the earning of income, then we see that if a person doesn't want to pay income taxes, then he should opt out of the income tax by finding a way to support himself that does not involve earning money and paying taxes on it. This is not to say, however, that he should nor even can avoid work altogether. He can forage and gather, hunt and trap, fish or homestead. These are forms of labor done for one's own benefit, not forms of work which primarily benefit others and occurs in the context of legitimized, regulated tax business activity. Gifting, trading, bartering, sharing, and trading out are all activities which benefit both oneself and someone else. Starting an untaxed cooperative or a not-for-profit organization are additional ways to work without paying taxes. However, those activities are not always practical, realistic, and legal alternatives to legitimate work. They're not always free either. Hunting and fishing are not free. People are usually required to pay fees for permits and licenses in order to engage in those activities. Homesteading and legal recognition thereof can take years and years. Giving gifts is not always free because of the gift tax and the estate tax. Additionally, when it is possible for the government to tax trade, it will attempt to do so, and that brings us to sales taxes. Many people who labor for others do so because they don't have enough surplus possessions to exchange for the resources they need. As such, they often have little wherewithal to make ends meet without selling their labor hours. As long as selling and working remain options, then both activities will be viewed as voluntary because each is an alternative to the other. The problem, however, is that when one choice is practically impossible or prohibitively expensive, then the other choice becomes the only realistic viable choice, and one choice is no real free choice at all. That is why the payment of sales taxes is, like income tax, is not always strictly voluntary. While some followers of conservative and capitalist schools of economics argue that the poor pay virtually no taxes whatsoever, all but 4 states have sales taxes. In 46 states, if you buy anything, food, cigarettes, alcohol, magazines, consumer goods, luxury items, then even if only in some small way, you are a taxpayer. In those 46 states, the only way to opt out of the sales tax is to buy nothing, which again is not always a viable option. Very few people can afford to buy nothing, especially not poor people, the sick, people in desperate need. That's why telling someone they can avoid taxes by buying less is almost like saying let them eat cake. People starving from lack of bread can't afford cake, just like people who have difficulty affording food can't afford to buy less. In addition to these flaws, the purpose of taxing the sold item often has little or nothing to do with what the tax is supposedly paying for. For example, we might be told that the gas tax pays for the roads, but funds are fungible and can be redirected. Furthermore, the purchase of gas does not necessarily indicate how much one will make use of the roads or damage them. In my opinion, instead of asking ourselves, does the spending justify the tax, we should be asking, is it economically efficient and fiscally sustainable to tax its behavior in the first place? And that should go regardless of what we're told about for what purposes those funds are being expended. We don't always know whether the sales tax is being paid by the seller or just passed on to the consumer either. After all, if the objective of the sales tax is to literally tax sales, then the seller should pay the tax, not the consumer. But if the objective is to deter consumption, then yes, the consumer should be paying the tax. But this begs the question, why should we tax sales and consumption in the first place? Excuse me. If increasing taxes on income really does result in lower revenues, then doesn't it follow that to impose a tax on sales or consumption may serve to discourage and deter selling and consuming? And why would we want to discourage those things? They're not harmful. Selling is not immoral as long as the exchange is voluntary and mutually beneficial. And we need to consume in order to survive, and consumption is not harmful in and of itself. Conspicuous excessive consumption is harmful sometimes, but only when it's wasteful. It's fine to tax waste if we do so knowing that taxing waste will discourage people from wasting resources. But consuming and selling do not necessarily result in waste. Taxing consumption, on the other hand, usually does result in waste, because the consumer purchases fewer resources with the money he has because of the sales tax than he likely would have if the sales tax did not exist. This leaves products, including perishables, on the shelves longer, which eventually have to be thrown away. And that's wasteful. And that's caused by high sales taxes, in a way. Additionally, sales taxes unnecessarily politicize trade and commerce by inviting government into transactions it had nothing to do with, by inviting it to tax them. Sales taxes and tariffs do little to nothing to encourage the safety or health of the product in question. Tariffs are not the same thing as inspection duties. They are fees on the importation or exportation of goods. Sales taxes, like tariffs, make it so that nobody can buy, sell, consume, import, or export without giving the government a cut. I call this the politicization of trade because sales taxes and tariffs make it impossible to engage in a transaction within a particular state or country without materially supporting the government through paying the tax and thus appearing to endorse its actions. It can be argued that the tariff is the least objectionable form of taxation from a constitutional standpoint, and from the biblical perspective that taxing foreigners is less objectionable than taxing one's own citizens. But despite those arguments, I don't support tariffs because I believe they lead to sanctions, which then lead to trade blocs, trade wars, cold wars, and even hot wars. These are the most extreme consequences of deriving too much government revenue from the taxation of sales, importation, and other aspects of trade, and especially using that money to subsidize your own domestic industry afterwards. Additionally, tariffs don't always tax foreigners. They tax the person doing the importing and the exporting. Tariffs on Chinese goods are paid by Americans who work in America importing foreign products. Our import tariffs do not impose any costs upon foreigners. That is, not unless the foreigners who are supposed to pay the tariffs find ways to discharge and externalize those costs onto the foreign firms who exported the goods. And sometimes even those firms will find more ways to externalize those costs onto their people, including by taxing them more and spending that revenue to subsidize domestic industry. On to the fair tax. The Libertarian Party's 2016 presidential nominee, Gary Johnson, supported the fair tax as his national taxation policy. The fair tax would have imposed a 23% value-added flat tax on all goods sold nationwide to go towards federal revenue. The fair tax would aim to replace all other federal sources of revenue, abolishing the IRS and eliminating taxes on income, estate, payroll, and gifts. While the fair tax does a lot of good things, such as simplify the tax code by taxing fewer activities and by ending discriminatory differential taxation with the flat tax, it has been criticized as regressive. However, the fair tax would have provided a prebate, that is, a preliminary rebate, compensating people for the costs they would incur throughout the year while paying for the tax. So not only is the fair tax flat, it is also neither regressive nor progressive. However, it could be argued that the fair tax prebate, whose full name is the FCA, the Family Consumption Allowance, could be argued that that renders the proposal a big government redistribution scheme, since the government would give households 12 monthly inflation-adjusted stipends a year. But with the FCA, households whose expenses are less than double the poverty level are eligible for the FCA and can opt to pay only an effective 11.5% in taxes, just half the rate which thriving enterprises would pay at the counter for the resources they purchase. So even if this makes the fair tax in any way redistributive or progressive, receiving that stipend does remain optional and voluntary. The fair tax arguably lives up to its name. But even if the fair tax can fix the federal budget, then states and local governments still have budgetary issues. And that's where property taxes come in. Many states with budget issues are looking towards increasing sales taxes and pitching this as the only way to avoid further increasing taxes on income and property. But the only reason we're having difficulty financing the government with property taxes, in my opinion, is that people aren't free to build on their land and make improvements to their property without permission, without paying. We are not free to try to boost our property value without being punished with higher property taxes. Sorry, this is a little repetitive. If this is at all true, then we can infer the solution to high property taxes, and also the way to save ourselves from having to increase income and sales taxes anymore to compensate for property tax solvency problems. The solution must involve figuring out how to allow us to make improvements to our property without having all the rewards of that labor confiscated by government, without being punished with high property taxes. As I said earlier, instead of taxing productive, harmless activities like earning income, buying and selling, building and making improvements, and investing, why don't we tax destructive activities? Again, consumption might result in waste, and it does destroy, but only while helping the person who's making use of it, like when you eat something. So why tax consumption when you can tax destruction and waste directly? Additionally, why support a national sales tax, or why just support that when taxing sales at the national level means that what states and localities tax has to be adjusted to avoid taxing sales too much at local state levels to avoid multiple and double taxation. Indeed, this is what Henry George proposed. Henry George wanted all or most public revenue to derive from the single tax, now known as land value taxation, or LVT, which would simplify taxes by taxing only land. Specifically, it is a tax on the inefficient use of land, which could also be described as not exactly a tax, but more of a ground rent on the unimproved value of land payable to the community. However, the single tax is not so simple because the full economic definition of land includes not only land, but also air and water, the raw materials of nature, and the electromagnetic spectrum. While this may seem like mission creep in tax policy, Henry George wanted labor and capital, that is, improvements upon the land, to remain entirely untaxed. And there's nothing unlibertarian or anti-free market about ensuring equal potential and opportunity to access land, so that we can build what we may on our own properties to sustain ourselves and become as independent as possible. Thus, Georgist economist Scott Baker of the Georgist group Common Ground USA described Georgism as laissez-faire in terms of production. In George's day, land was less monopolized and less hoarded, and thus less expensive, cheaper, and more easily available than it is now. This is a curious fact, given that it was FDR Democrats who implemented George's ideas, not the Democrats of the 1880s and 90s, who were at that time much more classically liberal than they are now, and who were merely inspired by George's ideas through FDR's adoption of certain proposals made by Norman Thomas, an early 20th century American socialist and a supporter of some, but not all, of Henry George's ideas. Thomas Paine said, "Men did not make the earth. It is the value of the improvement only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. If land is a scarce resource, then occupying it without using it, while excluding others from it, is an unfair relationship between the individual and community." Students of Thomas Paine and the economic schools of marginalism, physiocracy, and geonomics all subscribe to that idea. I'll agree with Paine and his criticism, that is. Similarly, Georgists endorse a ground rent on land, and additionally they believe that land should be owned either by no one or else by the entire community. Although George believed that the community should benefit from renting land, just like Locke, he believed in a reciprocal relationship between the individual and the rest of the community in regards to land ownership, not an unfair deal that benefits communities unfairly. Locke explained that our right to homestead property depends on doing it only, quote, "at least where there is enough and as good land left in common for others to homestead themselves." Henry George believed that the value of land should be determined by markets and that the value of the land should go back into the public purse. Fred Foldbury, in his articulation of geolibertarianism and geoanarchism, has promoted online artificial markets to evaluate land prices. In a libertarian or geolibertarian society, the community may wish to express itself solely through voluntary exchange if it wishes, and direct action and mutual aid, and other forms of untaxed activities which are unsupervised by the state. So long as you do not reject the idea of decentralizing power and allowing local governments to engage in more diverse modes of taxation, there's nothing about a Georgist society which would conflict with libertarian values. If our goal as libertarians is to increase the number of people who own land, then cooperative ownership and communal management of land are perfectly libertarian solutions to the problem of a first-come, first-served land allocation regime, characterized by monopolistic hoarding of land to fuel speculation and manipulate prices, not just by government cronies, but by the government itself, which unconstitutionally owns so much land out west. George proposed what he proposed precisely because he viewed the monopolization and hoarding of land as primary causes of the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. Opposing these monopolies and opposing the restraints on economic opportunity which they cause are common goals shared by both libertarians and Georgists. That is why a geolibertarian society is possible, especially given the decentralizing decision-making authority and administration and enforcement will allow different communities to enact different and hopefully optional tax rates on improvements, capital, and labor if they insist. Economics professor Nicolaus Tideman estimated that the value of all uncollected rent in the U.S. is roughly $5.3 trillion, about a quarter of the GDP. According to Georgist economist Scott Baker, that means that taxing land could easily pay for a decent-sized government. What is interesting about Henry George's proposal is that, once again, it would leave labor and capital entirely untaxed, while solely taxing the three classical factors of production. Yeah, the uncollected rent on the unimproved. Well, it's the rent that an owner pays. Yeah, I mean,
unrealized income.
Yeah, like the full. I mean, economic rent includes rent, interest, and profit, but the kind of leasing that associates with rent, that's kind of a more specific and simpler, definition of the term. But rent more broadly, the more expensive the land is and the more it's owned, then the more expensive all the land and capital that you can mix on it becomes. So to cease taxing labor and capital would achieve several of the goals of the fair tax, including eliminating the income tax. Most or all taxes on payroll and gifts might also be eliminated. Taxes on estates, however, will depend on how much of the land value is derived from land as opposed to the property above the ground level. Like the fair tax, land value taxation avoids imposing punitive and confiscatory taxes on the earning of income through income taxes. But unlike the fair tax, it avoids punishing trade through sales taxes. Georgia's land value taxation would aim to eliminate sales taxes, but this does not necessarily prevent a conflict between the LVT and the fair tax, because states and localities could tax solely land value, while the national government taxes solely sales without double taxation occurring. Earlier I asked if we must have taxes, then what kind of taxes would be best? Geolibertarians believe the best kind of taxes are those which are the least harmful, that is, the least harmful to productivity. Indeed, Milton Friedman called Henry George's proposal the least harmful tax ever proposed. By ceasing to confiscate the products of labor on land, Georgism would restore the incentive to improve the land, while removing the fear of having one's taxes raised as a result. This is because land value taxation treats the ground, that is, the soil, the water, and water rights underneath it, the minerals beneath it, and the rights to develop it, and the rights to uproot whomever's on top. It treats these differently from the improvements on top of the ground level, which were made by man and not by nature. Georgists say tax land, not man, and tax goods, not bads. In reference to LVT's punitive effect on waste and inefficient use of land, I like to say tax destruction, not production. I think 5 minutes should do it. Another Georgist slogan is tax land, not buildings. An experimental form of land value taxation, dubbed split rate taxation, involves taxing the unimproved value of land at a higher rate than the property value of the buildings on top of it. Several years ago, Ohio Governor John Kasich praised what happened in Pittsburgh. He was very vague about that. But by this, he was presumably referring to the dozen or so towns and cities in Pennsylvania which have experimented with split rate taxation, including Aliquippa, Allentown, Altoona, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Scranton, and others. Other places that have tried Georgist ideas include Arden, Delaware, Fairhope, Alabama, Maryland, Mexicali, Mexico, Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania, Russia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and Australia. What most jurisdictions found when they tried land value taxation and split rate taxation was their urban and suburban sprawl decreased, and so did the number of abandoned and unoccupied properties. Supporters of Georgist ideas hope that implementing these policies will lead to less speculation on the price of vacant lands, help make urban infrastructure more efficient, prevent and maybe even reverse urban and suburban sprawl, and ensure that development has a lighter impact on ecosystems. Additionally, LVT and split rate taxation discourage waste of space like single-level building. Land value taxation, Georgism. Discourage waste of space like single-level building without getting rid of parks, since land in pristine condition would be valued more and taxed less than unoccupied quote-unquote developments that aren't being developed. Conclusion, as libertarians, it would not be unreasonable to be concerned that Georgism's tax bad things idea could result in sin taxes and the use of the tax code to try to force people to become more moral or more responsible people, like through excessive taxes on buying alcohol, cigarettes, and soda. But Georgism does its best to avoid judgment concerning what we do with labor and capital and set the potential moralizing associated with it aside to make sure we all have equal opportunity to access land that's in good condition. And just to go back to a point earlier, if you don't want to pay the tax, then avoid the tax by avoiding the behavior. This is the easiest way to do that. It's very easy to avoid hoarding land and monopolizing large amounts of land and polluting land. Nowhere near as easy as avoiding sales and income. However, Georgists would find it necessary to impose what are called Pigouvian taxes, named after 20th century British economist Arthur Pigou. Pigouvian taxes penalize negative externalities, which are essentially synonymous with torts or non-aggression principle violations. They are outsourcings of responsibility to other people, such as to protect your property or clean up after you. Geolibertarians essentially view pollution, despoilation of land, air, and water, destruction of land, contamination of natural resources yet unclaimed, and abandoning land so as to allow it to fall into a blighted state that can barely support life. They view these as violent actions that need to be punished. Whatever labor and capital are mixed on spoiled land is doomed to fail. That is why arguments about socialism or capitalism are irrelevant whenever the land is threatened. So are arguments about whether to favor land or worker, or capital or workers. Whether pollution is wrong because it harms society or because it harms an individual, it's wrong. And whoever's responsible for that pollution should be held responsible for it. Aside from simplifying the tax code, reducing waste and blight and pollution, and allowing diverse property and tax regimes to be practiced in different jurisdictions operating on decentralized and localistic principles, Georgism has the potential to help bridge the gap between libertarians to the right and libertarians to the left. After all, LP co-founder David Nolan, who wrote the LP Pledge, was a geolibertarian. Conservatives from Milton Friedman to Winston Churchill to William F. Buckley have praised Henry George's ideas. Between them, the Democratic Freedom Caucus, the old guard paleo-liberal New Deal supporters who were aware of Henry George's historic influence on the Democratic platform, between them and mainstream economist Joseph Stiglitz and Green Party's Jill Stein, their support of Georgism, John Kasich's endorsement of what happened in Pittsburgh, and the rising number of geolibertarians in the LP, the time seems right to rescue Henry George's ideas from the dustbin of history and use them to solve our budgetary issues and tax woes once and for all. Suggesting the voluntary adoption of geolibertarian proposals on a decentralized, community-wide basis, which may include the establishment of community land trusts to allocate and protect land, will only go to show disenchanted voters that the LP does have suggestions about the environment and other things, not just monolithic, one-size-fits-all solutions, mind you, but ideas about how a tax could be implemented voluntarily if the community wishes to do so. And to be clear, that's the community, not the state. I'd like to make several notes in closing. First, it's possible the hunting permits and fishing licenses would continue to exist in a Georgist regime, but the savings the taxpayers would see in terms of income and sales taxes would make those licenses easily affordable. Additionally, many Georgists view natural resources, such as wild game and fishing stocks, as resources which belong to the commons, so taking natural resources you didn't create without replacing them should naturally incur some kind of fee, which is just the free market. Georgism might seem too left-wing or even socialist to some, but it is little more than the extension of libertarian principles to tax policy and environmental conservation. To adopt Georgist ideas into the libertarian movement would show Democrats and progressives that the LP does have some ideas about how to improve the quality of the environment without growing the government, additionally without growing the welfare state. Few Georgists would mind if all welfare, social, corporate, or otherwise, were eliminated, because LVT would afford all people equal opportunity to access land and access fair markets that are rid of monopolies and land hoarding. I'd like to encourage you to look up the Georgist interest group Common Ground USA and visit the blog progress.org and the Henry George School of Chicago at 30 East Adams Street, Suite 1207, and check out this literature. Thank you very much for having me.